A hot Australian summer day in 2012. Child welfare officers drive down a dusty, isolated road in rural New South Wales. They're expecting a routine welfare check. What they're about to discover will haunt them for the rest of their lives. What they found hidden in the Australian bush was so disturbing, so unthinkable, that it would become one of the most shocking cases in modern Australian history. This is not fiction. This is not exaggerated. This is the real story of the Colt family, a family tree so twisted and tangled that geneticists struggled to map it. A family where children didn't know who their real parents were. A family living in conditions that defied human imagination. And a secret that had been hidden for over 40 years. Before we dive into this disturbing true story, I need you to do 3 things. First, hit that subscribe button because we bring you the most shocking true crime stories you won't find anywhere else. Second, smash that like button if you're ready for the truth. And third, turn on notifications because YouTube doesn't want you to see content like this. Now, let's expose what really happened to the Colt family. June 2012. The New South Wales Department of Family and Community Services received an anonymous tip. Someone had reported seeing children living in terrible conditions on a remote property near the small town of Borowa, about 3 hours southwest of Sydney. The caller described children who appeared malnourished, dirty, and completely isolated from society. At first, it seemed like just another case of neglect in rural Australia. The social workers had seen poverty before. They had dealt with difficult living situations. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared them for what they were about to witness. When the welfare officers arrived at the property, they immediately noticed something was wrong. The smell hit them first, a putrid mixture of human waste, rotting garbage, and decay that burned their nostrils even before they left their vehicles. The property itself looked like something from a post-apocalyptic nightmare. There were no proper houses, just a collection of dilapidated caravans, makeshift tents, and crude shelters constructed from rusted metal sheets and tarpaulins. Some family members were living in structures that barely qualified as shelter, exposed to the elements and vermin. As they walked through the property, the officers saw children, dozens of them, ranging from toddlers to teenagers, all in various states of undress, covered in dirt, and exhibiting behaviors that immediately raised red flags. The children's hair was matted and filthy. Their clothes were nothing more than rags. Many had visible sores and infections on their bodies. But it wasn't just their physical appearance that disturbed the officers. It was their behavior. The children communicated in grunts and gestures. Most couldn't speak properly. They seemed feral, almost animal, like in their movements and interactions. The living conditions were beyond comprehension. There was no running water, no electricity, no bathroom facilities. Human feces were scattered around the property. Dead animals in various stages of decomposition lay where they had fallen. The sleeping areas were filthy mattresses thrown directly on the ground, often shared by multiple people. Food was scarce, and what little there was had often gone bad. The children ate whatever they could find, including raw and spoiled meat. But the physical squalor was just the beginning of the horror. As officers began documenting the scene and attempting to communicate with the family members, they started noticing something deeply disturbing about the family structure. Children couldn't identify their parents. Siblings shared the same eyes, the same facial features, the same physical deformities. There were adults who looked far older than their actual ages, children with developmental delays that suggested serious genetic problems, and a family tree that made no logical sense. One officer later testified that she had never seen anything like it in her 20-year career. The family members moved around each other in ways that suggested relationships that were not normal. There was no clear parental authority, no structure, no boundaries, just a chaotic mass of humanity living in the most primitive conditions imaginable, somewhere in 21st century Australia. Within hours, the decision was made. This was not a case that could be handled with family support services or minor intervention. This was a full-scale rescue operation. Police were called in, medical professionals were summoned, child protection officers from across the state were mobilized. Over the next 48 hours, 12 children ranging in age from 2 to 17 were removed from the property and placed into emergency care. The adults were detained for questioning, and investigators began the painstaking process of trying to understand what had been happening in this isolated bush camp. The children were immediately taken to hospitals for medical evaluation. What doctors found was shocking even to experienced pediatricians. Most of the children had never seen a doctor in their lives. They had no vaccinations, no dental care. Many suffered from serious, untreated medical conditions. Several had vision problems that had never been addressed. Dental examinations revealed mouths full of rotted teeth and abscesses. The children were malnourished, underweight, and showed signs of long-term neglect. But the physical problems were only part of the picture. As investigators began interviewing family members and piecing together the history of the Colt clan, a horrifying pattern emerged. This was not simply a case of poverty or rural isolation. This was a family that had been engaging in systematic incest for multiple generations. The family patriarch, identified only as Tim Colt, for legal reasons, had allegedly been having sexual relationships with his daughters. Those daughters had children with their father, their brothers, and their own sons. The genetic entanglement was so severe that scientists brought in to analyze DNA samples struggled to create an accurate family tree. Court documents would later reveal that at least 11 children on the property were the product of incestuous relationships. Some children had parents who were also siblings. Others were the offspring of parent-child relationships spanning multiple generations. The genetic damage was catastrophic. Many of the children suffered from rare genetic disorders typically only seen when close relatives reproduce. There were cases of hearing loss, vision problems, speech impediments, intellectual disabilities, and physical deformities, all consequences of the extreme inbreeding. Geneticists who examined the family's DNA described it as one of the most severe cases of inbreeding they had ever encountered in a modern context. The coefficient of inbreeding, which measures the probability that a person has inherited identical gene copies from related parents, was off the charts for several children. In normal populations, this number is close to 0. In the Colt family, some children had coefficients comparable to those found in laboratory animals deliberately inbred for research purposes. Investigators began tracing the family's history backward, trying to understand how this situation had developed. What they discovered was a multi-generational pattern of isolation, abuse, and incest that stretched back decades. The family had originally come from somewhere in rural Australia, though exact details remained murky. Tim Colt, the patriarch, had apparently learned the pattern from his own family. There were suggestions that inbreeding had been occurring for at least 3 or possibly 4 generations before authorities discovered the camp. The family had moved frequently, always staying in remote, isolated areas where they could avoid detection. They kept their children out of school, away from doctors, and hidden from any official records. When neighbors or local authorities became suspicious in one location, the family would simply pack up and move to another isolated spot. This pattern of movement and concealment had allowed them to avoid detection for decades. The children born into this situation had never known any other life. To them, this was normal. They had no concept of the outside world, no education, and no understanding that their situation was not just unusual but deeply wrong. Family members later revealed that outsiders were feared and treated with extreme suspicion. Children were taught that the outside world was dangerous, that officials would hurt them, and that they could only trust family members. This psychological isolation was as effective as the physical isolation. Even when opportunities arose for escape or intervention, family members were too conditioned by fear and ignorance to seek help. The younger children had literally never left the property. They had never seen a town, never interacted with other children, never experienced anything beyond the hellish existence in their isolated camp. As psychologists began working with the rescued children, the full extent of the abuse became apparent. The incest was not hidden or shameful within the family. It was normalized and systematic. Older children were groomed from young ages to accept sexual relationships with parents and siblings as normal family behavior. Resistance was met with violence and intimidation. The power structure within the family was maintained through fear, manipulation, and complete information control. Several of the older children described witnessing sexual abuse from their earliest memories. They spoke of not understanding that what was happening was wrong because they had never been taught any different. Education was non-existent. The children couldn't read or write. Most could barely speak coherent English. Their developmental ages were years behind their chronological ages. A 15-year-old might have the cognitive abilities of a 7-year-old. The combination of genetic damage, malnutrition, lack of education, and psychological trauma had created severe developmental delays across the board. The girls in the family were particularly victimized. From puberty onward, they were treated as breeding stock for male family members. Pregnancies were common and occurred in quick succession. There was no prenatal care, no medical supervision of births, and no postnatal support. Several girls had given birth to children with severe disabilities who died shortly after birth or in infancy. These deaths were never reported. The bodies were buried on the property or disposed of in ways that left no trace. The true number of children born into and lost by the Colt family may never be known. Prosecutors faced an enormous challenge. The Colt family case was unlike anything in Australian legal history. How do you charge people for crimes that occurred in such isolation that the perpetrators themselves didn't fully understand they were committing crimes? How do you gather evidence when victims are too traumatized or mentally delayed to testify coherently? How do you prove specific acts when the pattern of abuse was so widespread and long-standing that no one could remember specific dates or incidents? The prosecution strategy focused on the undeniable physical evidence. DNA tests proved beyond doubt that incest had occurred. Medical examinations documented the abuse and neglect. The living conditions spoke for themselves through photographs and video evidence that shocked even hardened investigators. But the legal proceedings would drag on for years as the courts grappled with the complexity of the case and the need to protect the privacy and dignity of the victims, particularly the children. Multiple family members were eventually charged with various offenses including incest, child abuse, and child neglect. The patriarch, Tim Colt, faced the most serious charges. Court proceedings revealed that he had fathered children with at least 3 of his daughters, and possibly more. DNA evidence showed he was the father and grandfather, sometimes the great-grandfather, of many of the children removed from the property. His daughters, themselves victims who had become perpetrators, faced charges related to their own incestuous relationships and their failure to protect younger children in the family. The trial proceedings, conducted largely behind closed doors to protect victim identities, revealed details that shocked the Australian public. Court-appointed psychologists testified about the severe psychological damage inflicted on the children. Medical experts explained the genetic consequences of multi-generational incest. Social workers described the living conditions and the rescue operation. Each revelation seemed more disturbing than the last. One particularly heartbreaking aspect of the case involved the older children who had both been victims and had gone on to abuse younger siblings. These individuals occupied a gray area in the legal system. They were clearly victims of horrific abuse themselves, groomed from childhood into accepting incestuous relationships as normal. Yet they had also perpetrated abuse against others. The courts struggled with how to handle these cases, ultimately deciding that context mattered. Those who had been most severely victimized and had limited capacity to understand their actions received lighter sentences focused on rehabilitation rather than punishment. The patriarch and other senior family members who had initiated and maintained the pattern of abuse received significant prison sentences. Tim Colt was sentenced to multiple decades in prison on numerous counts of incest and child abuse. Other adult family members received sentences ranging from several years to over a decade, depending on their role in the abuse and their own victimization. The sentencing judge noted that this was one of the most disturbing cases to ever come before an Australian court, describing it as a cycle of abuse and depravity that had destroyed multiple generations. Throughout the legal proceedings, extraordinary measures were taken to protect the identities of the victims. The family name Colt is a pseudonym created by the courts. The exact location of the property was never publicly disclosed. Details that might identify specific victims were redacted from court documents. This protection was considered essential, not just for the victims' immediate safety, but for their long-term prospects of recovery and reintegration into society. The children removed from the property faced an incredibly difficult journey toward recovery. Most were placed in specialized foster care with families trained to deal with severe trauma and develop mental delays. They required extensive medical treatment, psychological therapy, educational intervention, and basic life skills training. Many had never used a toilet, never eaten with utensils, never slept in a bed, never worn clean clothes. Every aspect of normal life had to be taught from scratch. Progress was slow and often heartbreaking. Some children struggled to bond with foster families, having never experienced healthy attachment. Others had such severe developmental delays that independent living might never be possible. A few older victims chose to stay in touch with each other, the only family they had ever known, despite the horror of their shared past. The psychological scars of their experience would last a lifetime. Therapists working with the victims described their treatment as some of the most challenging cases imaginable, requiring years or even decades of intensive support. The Colt family case forced Australia to confront uncomfortable questions about how such extreme abuse could occur undetected for decades in a modern developed nation. Multiple systems had failed. The family had moved through various regions, and no agency had connected the dots. Children were never enrolled in school, yet no truancy officers investigated. The family accessed some government services without raising red flags. Neighbors in various locations had suspicions but often didn't report them, or their reports were not followed up adequately. Investigators identified several systemic failures. Rural isolation made detection difficult, but not impossible. Better information sharing between states and agencies might have caught the pattern earlier. Mandatory reporting requirements for professionals who encounter children were not consistently followed. The family's nomadic lifestyle allowed them to stay one step ahead of any developing concerns. And there was a cultural reluctance in rural areas to interfere in family business. Even when the situation appeared concerning, the case led to significant reforms in Australian child protection systems. New protocols were implemented for tracking families who move frequently between jurisdictions. Information sharing between states was improved. Training for welfare officers, police, and medical professionals was enhanced to help them recognize signs of extreme isolation and abuse. And public awareness campaigns emphasize that protecting children is everyone's responsibility, not just that of official agencies. The Colt family case also provided disturbing insights into the biological consequences of sustained inbreeding. Geneticists who studied the family's DNA published findings that contributed to scientific understanding of how closely related individuals reproducing over multiple generations affects human health and development. The children showed elevated rates of almost every genetic disorder associated with consanguinity, from relatively minor issues like hearing loss to severe intellectual disabilities and physical deformities. This genetic evidence became a key part of the legal case, definitively proving the incestuous relationships and demonstrating the harm caused. But it also raised ethical questions about genetic privacy and the use of DNA evidence. The children's genetic information, which revealed the circumstances of their conception, became part of the public record, albeit in redacted form. Scientists debated whether studying the family's genetics, even with protective measures, might stigmatize the victims further or reduce them to medical specimens rather than recognizing them as trauma survivors. The medical community also grappled with how to treat the long-term health consequences. Many of the genetic conditions the children suffered were incurable. They would deal with health problems related to their biological origins for their entire lives. Some would require lifelong medical care and assistance. The healthcare costs associated with treating the Colt family victims reached into the millions of dollars, all borne by the Australian taxpayer. This raised difficult societal questions about responsibility and support for victims of such extreme abuse. While the Colt family case was uniquely horrific in its scale and severity, it was not an isolated phenomenon. Investigators discovered that similar cases, though usually smaller in scope, occur more frequently than the public realizes. In the United States, cases like the Whittaker family in West Virginia and the Goler clan in Nova Scotia, Canada, revealed similar patterns of multi-generational incest and isolation. These cases share common features: extreme rural isolation, strong patriarchal control, deliberate disconnection from institutions like schools and hospitals, and normalization of incest within the family system. The existence of multiple such cases raises troubling questions about how many similar situations might currently exist undetected. Experts estimate that for every case discovered, others remain hidden. The very isolation and secrecy that characterize these families make them extremely difficult to detect until something forces them into contact with authorities. Often, it's only when a family member escapes or an outsider accidentally discovers the situation that intervention becomes possible. International child protection experts now recognize isolated incestuous families as a distinct category of abuse requiring specialized intervention strategies. The patterns are so consistent across different cases that warning signs have been identified. Families with no fixed address, children never enrolled in school, avoidance of all medical care, extreme suspicion of outsiders, and reports of concerning behavior from neighbors. When these factors combine, they should trigger immediate investigation rather than being dismissed as merely unusual lifestyle choices. Today, more than a decade after their rescue, the Colt family children are scattered across Australia. Most live under new identities, trying to build lives far removed from their horrific origins. Some have made remarkable progress, gaining education, forming healthy relationships, and working toward independence. Others continue to struggle with the profound trauma and develop mental challenges resulting from their early years. A few, tragically, have been unable to escape the patterns they learned, continuing cycles of dysfunction in their own adult lives despite intensive intervention. The patriarch, Tim Colt, died in prison in 2009 before the case was fully adjudicated. Other family members who received prison sentences have since been released, though most live under strict supervision and with court orders preventing them from contacting victims. The property where the family was discovered has been cleared, leaving no trace of the horror that occurred there. Only in court records, sealed to protect victim identities, does the full truth of what happened remain documented. The Colt family case stands as a stark reminder that extreme abuse can occur even in modern, developed societies when isolation, ignorance, and systemic failures combine. It demonstrates the absolute necessity of vigilance in protecting vulnerable children and the importance of systems that can detect and respond to abuse, even in remote or hidden situations. Most importantly, it reminds us that recovery from such profound trauma is possible, though the path is long and difficult. If you or someone you know is experiencing abuse, please reach out to authorities or support services. In Australia, call 13 11 14 for 24/7 counseling support. In other countries, similar helplines exist. Remember, breaking the silence is the first step toward escape and recovery. This has been the true story of Australia's most disturbing family. If this video opened your eyes to the reality of hidden abuse, please share it to raise awareness. Hit that like button, subscribe to this channel for more shocking true stories, and let me know in the comments what case you want us to cover next. Until next time, stay safe, stay informed, and never stop questioning what might be hidden just out of sight.